The night before my wedding, my grandmother took my hand and whispered, "Don't let him put the ring on your finger." What did she see? If you love what we do, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel, and may the force of Reddit be with you. If you've ever ignored a warning because it came from someone everyone else called crazy, you might understand why I almost didn't survive the biggest mistake of my life. Sometimes the people who love us don't speak in facts. Sometimes they speak in fear. And sometimes, fear is the only thing standing between you and a life you'll never escape. My name is Emily Carter. For almost 30 years, I believed that every family had one relative nobody talked about. Ours was my grandmother, Margaret. She wasn't estranged. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't even particularly eccentric. People were simply uncomfortable around her. The silence that followed whenever someone mentioned her name wasn't ordinary silence. It was the kind that settles over a room after someone accidentally reveals a terrible secret. My mother changed the subject. My father cleared his throat. My older brother rolled his eyes and muttered something about Grandma's weird predictions. No one argued. No one laughed. They simply moved on, as if pretending she didn't exist somehow made life safer. But it never stopped me from visiting her, every Saturday, without fail. For 23 years, Grandma Margaret lived alone outside the tiny mountain town of Ashford, Tennessee. The road leading to her farmhouse twisted through forests so thick that sunlight barely reached the pavement. In autumn, the trees burned orange and crimson. In winter, they looked like skeletal hands stretching toward the sky. The locals joked that GPS stopped working near her property because even satellites didn't like visiting witches. They laughed, but none of them drove past her house after dark. Her home smelled unlike any place I'd ever known. Fresh cedar, dry lavender, rain-soaked earth, old books, warm cinnamon. There was always something simmering in a cast-iron pot. Bundles of herbs hung from every ceiling beam. Hundreds of glass jars lined handmade wooden shelves. Some held flowers, others roots. Some contained liquids so dark they looked like bottled shadows. When I was little, I asked what they were. She smiled without looking up. "You'll know when you need them." She never explained further. People said she could see things. Not ghosts. Not spirits. People. She looked at them the way doctors studied x-rays. Only she wasn't searching bones. She searched something buried much deeper. The soul. I never asked whether it was true. Because growing up, I watched too many impossible things happen. When I was 8 years old, a deputy sheriff knocked on our front door. He asked if my father had gone fishing with his best friend that morning. Dad looked confused. "No. Why?" The deputy frowned. "Someone called us at dawn saying we should search Miller's Crossing." My father looked toward my grandmother, who had been sitting on the porch shelling peas since sunrise. She never looked up, never smiled, never reacted. Hours later, they found my father's friend trapped beneath his overturned fishing boat, alive. Barely. The deputy asked who made the anonymous call. Nobody ever found out. When I turned 12, Grandma refused to let me attend my middle school's annual camping trip. She didn't yell. She didn't argue. She simply held my backpack before I left, then quietly unzipped it, removed my sleeping bag, closed the bag again. "You won't need this," I cried. I screamed. I told her she was ruining my life. My parents overruled her. But late that night, a stomach virus hit me so hard I ended up in the emergency room instead of boarding the bus. The next afternoon, a flash flood destroyed the campground. Nobody died, but several students were rescued by helicopter. My classmates spent 18 terrifying hours stranded on higher ground. Grandma never mentioned it again. Coincidence. That's what my father called every one of her predictions. Lucky guesses. Probability. Confirmation bias. He had an explanation for everything. Except, he never laughed when Grandma spoke. Neither did anyone else. By the time I graduated from college, I had built a perfectly ordinary life. Accounting degree, stable job, small apartment in Nashville, reliable paycheck, predictable routine. The kind of life that felt safe, comfortable, manageable. Until I met Daniel. People often say they knew instantly. That lightning struck. That the world stopped. It wasn't like that. Daniel entered my life quietly, like sunlight slipping through curtains. We met because my coworker accidentally took my lunch from the office refrigerator. She apologized, bought me coffee, introduced me to her older brother. Daniel. Tall. Confident. Kind eyes. Easy smile. The sort of man who remembered small things. He remembered I hated onions. Remembered my birthday after hearing it only once. Remembered the novel I mentioned wanting to read. 2 weeks later, He surprised me with a first edition copy. Not expensive, just thoughtful. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had paid that much attention to me. Our relationship unfolded slowly, comfortably, naturally. Every date seemed easier than the last. He volunteered at animal shelters, called his mother every Sunday, held doors open without making a performance of it. He laughed easily, listened carefully, never interrupted. Friends adored him. My parents adored him. Even my cynical brother admitted, "If you don't marry him, somebody else will." I almost believed I'd won the lottery. Almost. Because one Saturday, about 6 months after we met, Grandma asked an odd question. Not about Daniel, not about our future. She simply looked at my hands, then asked, "When he talks, what do his eyes do?" I blinked. "What? His eyes? They smile." I laughed. "They're supposed to." Grandma slowly shook her head. "No, happy people smile, kind people smile. But eyes." She leaned closer. "Eyes never learn how to lie." A chill crept across my skin. "What are you trying to tell me?" She reached across the table, covered my hand with hers. Her fingers felt colder than usual. "I don't know yet. Just watch. Not when he's speaking. When he thinks nobody is looking." That sentence stayed with me. For months, I tried watching him. I really did. At restaurants, at grocery stores, during family dinners. Nothing seemed wrong. If anything, he appeared kinder than ever. He tipped generously, helped strangers, carried groceries for elderly neighbors, volunteered without being asked. I started wondering if maybe, for the first time in her life, Grandma had made a mistake. Exactly 1 year after we met, Daniel proposed. It happened during a charity gala beneath thousands of tiny white lights. A string quartet played softly in the background. He knelt, opened a velvet box, and asked, "Will you spend forever with me?" People applauded before I even answered. I cried, laughed, then whispered, "Yes." It felt like the happiest moment of my life. Until the next morning. Because I drove straight to Grandma's house, excited to show her the ring. Instead of celebrating, she stared at it for nearly a full minute, without touching it, without smiling, without saying congratulations. Finally, she looked directly into my eyes and asked one question that stole every ounce of joy from my heart. "Emily, when he slipped that ring onto your finger, why did he look over your shoulder instead of at you?" The more I watched the man I loved, the more I realized my grandmother hadn't been warning me about our wedding. She was warning me about what would happen after. The drive home from my grandmother's farmhouse felt longer than usual. The engagement ring glittered every time my hand crossed the steering wheel. Most women would have spent the entire trip smiling, imagining flower arrangements, honeymoon destinations, and wedding vows. Instead, one question echoed through my mind. Why did he look over my shoulder? It sounded ridiculous, almost childish. Surely Grandma had misunderstood. Maybe someone had walked behind me. Maybe the photographer had called his name. Maybe. No. I stopped myself. For years, I'd watched people dismiss her warnings by inventing comfortable explanations. I wasn't going to become one of them. Not yet. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible had settled over my life. Like standing outside just before a thunderstorm. The air feels perfectly calm, yet every instinct tells you lightning is coming. Wedding planning consumed the next several months. Daniel threw himself into it with surprising enthusiasm. He compared venues, sampled caterers, debated invitation fonts, even created spreadsheets more detailed than the ones I used at work. Everyone admired him. "Emily," my mother whispered one afternoon while trying on dresses, "you found one of the good ones." "I know. And he loves you." "I know. He looks at you like you're the only woman in the room." I smiled. "I know." But deep inside, a tiny voice quietly answered, "Does he?" One evening, while we were touring a restored barn that had become a popular wedding venue, something strange happened. The owner excused herself to answer a phone call. Daniel wandered toward the windows overlooking the vineyards. I stayed behind, pretending to admire floral decorations. He thought he was alone. For maybe 3 seconds, his entire expression changed. His smile disappeared, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes became empty. Not angry, not sad, simply cold, completely emotionless, like someone switching off a light. Then the owner returned, instantly. The warmth came back, the charming smile, the sparkling eyes. the affectionate laugh. If I hadn't witnessed it myself, I would have believed I'd imagined everything. That Saturday, I returned to Grandma's. I didn't mention the vineyard. I didn't mention Daniel. She poured tea as usual, added honey, pushed a plate of homemade biscuits toward me. Finally, she asked, "You saw something." It wasn't a question. I looked up slowly. "How did you know?" She smiled faintly. "You came here searching for permission to ignore it." I stared into my tea. Steam drifted upward between us. "I don't know what I saw." "You don't have to. You only have to remember it happened." For the first time in my life, I asked her directly, "Grandma, what exactly are you?" She laughed, a genuine laugh, the kind that wrinkles every corner of the eyes. "I'm an old woman. No, you know what I mean." She looked toward the window where rain tapped softly against ancient glass. "I notice things. Everyone notices things. They simply stop looking before the truth appears." She picked up an old photograph sitting on the windowsill. It showed my grandfather decades earlier. Young, strong, smiling. "He lied to me once." My eyes widened. "You never told me that. I never needed to." "What happened?" Grandma gently traced the edge of the faded photograph. "He said he'd quit gambling. He hadn't. How did you know?" She smiled sadly. "He kissed me." I frowned. "What does that mean? When someone carries guilt, they don't kiss the same way." I couldn't help laughing. "That's impossible. So is recognizing your own mother by footsteps. But you can." She looked directly at me. "The body always tells the truth. The mouth merely negotiates." Those words followed me home. I started watching people differently. Cashiers, coworkers, neighbors, the mail carrier, a waitress flirting with customers while silently rolling her eyes after walking away, a manager congratulating employees while clenching his jaw. Tiny inconsistencies, small fractures beneath polished surfaces. I wondered, had they always been there? Or had Grandma simply taught me where to look? Daniel noticed something had changed. "You've been quiet lately." "I'm just tired." "You sure?" "Work." He reached across the dinner table, covered my hand. "I miss your smile." It should have melted my heart. Instead, for the first time, I noticed something. His hand felt warm, gentle, comforting. But his eyes never left my engagement ring, only for a moment. Then they returned to me. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Again. Weeks passed. Nothing dramatic happened. No arguments. No betrayals. No shocking discoveries. Life remained. Perfect. Almost too perfect. That's what frightened me. Because real life isn't perfect. Real people forget anniversaries, lose patience, burn dinner, apologize, laugh, cry. Daniel rarely did any of those things. It was as if he knew exactly what the perfect fiancé should look like, and he played the role flawlessly. One Friday evening, my best friend Claire invited us to dinner. Halfway through dessert, she excused herself to answer the front door. Daniel stood to help clear plates. I stayed behind in the dining room. As he walked into the kitchen, his phone buzzed. Once, twice, 3 times. He glanced around. Believing nobody was watching, he smiled. Not the smile he gave me. This one was different, hungry, private, almost relieved. Then he typed a reply faster than I'd ever seen. By the time he returned carrying coffee cups, the expression was gone. "Everything okay?" I asked casually. "Just work." He didn't hesitate, didn't stumble, didn't blink, just work. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. His answer echoed louder than it should have. Just work. It wasn't the words. It was how quickly they arrived, as if he'd prepared them long before I ever asked. The following morning, I almost did something I promised myself I'd never do. Check his phone. I hated the idea. Relationships without trust weren't relationships. They were investigations. I refused to become suspicious, controlling, paranoid, so I didn't. Instead, I made breakfast. We laughed, watched a movie, walked through the farmer's market. For several hours, everything felt normal again. Until we stopped at an antique shop. Daniel wandered deeper inside. The elderly owner approached me. She couldn't have been younger than 85. She smiled politely, then looked toward Daniel. Her smile slowly disappeared. Without taking her eyes off him, she quietly asked, "Is that your husband?" "Almost," she nodded once, then whispered words that made every hair on my arm stand up. "Sweetheart, be careful who you build a future with. Some people don't collect antiques. They collect lives. Before I could ask what she meant, Daniel returned carrying an old brass compass. The woman immediately smiled again, as though she'd never spoken at all. Driving home, I didn't tell Daniel what she'd said. I simply watched him. For miles. He hummed along with the radio, tapped the steering wheel, smiled whenever I looked his way. The picture of the perfect man. Yet, two women, decades apart, who had never met, had looked at him and instantly felt afraid. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe. My grandmother wasn't the only person who knew how to see beyond appearances. That night, just before falling asleep, Daniel wrapped an arm around me. I love you. I love you too. He kissed my forehead. Within minutes, his breathing became slow and steady. I remained awake, listening, thinking, wondering. Then, in the darkness, his phone lit up on the nightstand. Only once. A message preview appeared before the screen faded black again. I wasn't trying to read it, but I couldn't stop my eyes. It contained only 4 words. She suspects something, and my blood instantly ran cold. The message wasn't the scariest part. It was discovering who had sent it. I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. The 4 words burned into my mind like they had been carved there with a knife. She suspects something. I stared at the dark ceiling while Daniel slept peacefully beside me. His breathing was slow, steady, comforting. It was the breathing of a man without a single worry in the world. Mine came in short, uneven bursts. Every few minutes I glanced toward his phone. The screen stayed black, silent, as if nothing had happened. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe the message had nothing to do with me. Maybe it was about work, about a coworker, about someone else's wife. The human mind has a remarkable talent for protecting itself. When the truth feels unbearable, it manufactures softer versions. I wanted one of those softer versions. Desperately. Morning arrived with pale gray light spilling through the curtains. Daniel stretched, smiled, and kissed my forehead. Morning, beautiful. His voice sounded exactly the way it always had. Warm, gentle, safe. I forced a smile. Morning. He disappeared into the bathroom. The shower started. Steam rolled beneath the door. I looked toward the nightstand. His phone wasn't there. My stomach tightened. He had taken it into the bathroom. Why? He had never done that before. During breakfast, he talked excitedly about wedding plans. The florist had confirmed. The caterer needed one final payment. His cousin had booked a flight. He sounded genuinely happy. Every sentence made me question myself even more. Could someone planning a future so carefully also be hiding another life? The contradiction exhausted me. That afternoon, my best friend Claire stopped by my apartment. She took one look at me and frowned. "You look awful." "I didn't sleep. You and Daniel fight?" "No." She studied me. "You know you can't lie to me." I laughed weakly. I wish I could. Claire had known me since kindergarten. She could always tell when something was wrong, usually before I could. I debated telling her everything. Grandma's warning, the antique shop, the mysterious message. Instead, I asked a strange question. "Have you ever met someone who seemed too perfect?" She raised an eyebrow. "You mean fake?" "I don't know." Claire leaned back. "My dad used to say something." "What?" "Real people are inconsistent. The dangerous ones rehearse." The words landed harder than she realized. That evening, I drove to my parents' house. Not because I needed advice, because I needed normal. Mom was making lasagna. Dad was watching baseball. The television blared from the living room. Everything felt ordinary, comforting. For almost an hour, I forgot about the message. Then Dad casually asked, "So, how's Daniel?" I hesitated. "Too long." Mom noticed immediately. "What happened?" "Nothing, Emily." My father muted the television. "What happened?" I told them. "Not everything, just enough." The strange feeling. The message. Grandma's concerns. Dad sighed heavily. "Your grandmother has been planting doubts in your head your whole life." "Maybe. But the message?" Mom asked quietly. "Could it have been work?" "I don't know." Dad nodded. "Then don't destroy your relationship over assumptions. Logical. Reasonable." Exactly what I'd expected him to say. Yet even he seemed less certain than usual. Before leaving, Mom hugged me, longer than normal. As I reached my car, she called after me. "Emily?" I turned. She looked toward the house to make sure Dad couldn't hear. Then she whispered, "I never told your father this. But once, your grandmother saved my life too." I froze. "What?" Mom looked almost embarrassed. "It was before you were born. She begged me not to take a business trip. I thought she was being dramatic." "What happened?" "I canceled because she frightened me." She swallowed. "The hotel caught fire that night." I stared at her. "You never told anyone?" I didn't want to admit she might have been right. The drive home felt surreal. For the first time, someone besides me had admitted Grandma's warnings couldn't simply be dismissed. Maybe they weren't predictions. Maybe they were observations so precise they appeared supernatural. If that was true, what exactly had she seen in Daniel? Saturday couldn't come fast enough. I found Grandma in her greenhouse trimming rosemary. Without looking up, she smiled. "You finally asked your mother." I stopped walking. "How?" She laughed softly. "Because she promised me 28 years ago she'd tell you someday." "You knew?" "Of course." She placed the scissors on the table. "Sit." We spent almost an hour in silence. Tea, fresh bread, honey. Exactly as always. Finally, I asked, "What do you actually see when you look at people?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pointed toward the window. A pair of crows sat on the fence. "What do you notice?" "They're birds." She smiled. "Look again." One crow hopped closer. The other stepped away. Again. Closer. Away. "They're communicating," I said. "Exactly. You noticed because you stopped labeling them as birds." She looked back at me. "Most people stop looking once they have a name for something. Man, woman, husband, friend. They stop paying attention. I never stop. I thought about that all week. Not labels. Behavior. Not promises. Patterns. Not words. Choices." Then, 3 days before our wedding, something happened that changed everything. Daniel called. His voice sounded unusually excited. "I've got a surprise." "What kind?" "You'll see tonight." When he arrived, he handed me an envelope. Inside were 2 first-class airline tickets. Paris. My dream destination. The honeymoon I'd secretly wanted but never expected we could afford. I threw my arms around him. "This is incredible," he smiled. "I wanted to give you something unforgettable." Then his phone rang. He stepped into the hallway. The apartment became quiet. Very quiet. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but one sentence drifted through the half-open door. "After the wedding, everything changes." A pause. Then, "No, she still doesn't know." Silence. Another pause. Then he laughed. Not his usual laugh. Lower. Sharper. Satisfied. By the time he returned, his warm smile had returned too. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just my travel agent." He didn't hesitate, not even for a second. That night, for the first time, I didn't believe him, not because of what he said, because of what I had finally learned to see. His smile reached his mouth. But never his eyes. The wedding never happened, but what I discovered in the next 48 hours was far worse than infidelity. People often imagine that the moment you stop trusting someone, everything becomes clear. It doesn't. It becomes louder. Every smile, every hug, every "I love you," every ordinary moment suddenly feels like evidence or a performance. I didn't know which terrified me more. The possibility that Daniel was lying, or the possibility that I was slowly losing my mind. The wedding was only 72 hours away. Friends were arriving from different states. The florist had already delivered hundreds of white roses to the venue. My wedding dress hung in my bedroom like a promise, or a warning. I couldn't tell anymore. Daniel continued acting exactly as he always had. Coffee every morning, goodnight texts every evening, gentle kisses, small surprises. Anyone watching us would have envied our relationship. Yet every time he smiled, I remembered my grandmother's words. The body tells the truth. The mouth negotiates. I decided I needed facts. Not feelings. Not intuition. Facts. So instead of checking his phone, I watched his routine. Monday, gym. Office. Dinner with me. Tuesday. Work. Grocery store. Home. Wednesday. Everything changed. Around 4 in the afternoon, he texted me. "Running late. Emergency meeting. Don't wait up for dinner. Love you." Completely ordinary. Except 30 minutes later, Claire called. "Emily, you'll never believe who I just saw." My stomach tightened. "Who?" "Daniel." I frowned. "That's impossible." "He texted me 5 minutes ago. He's still at work." Claire was silent, then quietly said, I'm looking directly at him. The world seemed to stop. Where? There's a place downtown called Hawthorne House. The old hotel? Yeah. He just walked inside. Are you sure? I've met him 20 times. It's him. My heart hammered so hard I thought Claire might hear it through the phone. Stay there. I'm coming. The drive felt endless. Every red light became torture. Every slow driver felt like an enemy. When I finally reached the hotel, Claire was waiting across the street. She pointed without speaking. There. Daniel stood inside the lobby. Not alone. He was speaking with an older man. Gray hair, expensive suit, silver cane. The two shook hands, then hugged. Not like business associates. Like family. Do you know him? Claire whispered. No, but something about the older man's face bothered me. I'd seen him before. Somewhere. I just couldn't remember where. The two men disappeared into a private elevator. Minutes later, a black SUV pulled away from the hotel's underground garage. Claire looked at me. What now? I stared after the vehicle. I think we're following them. We kept several cars between us. The SUV drove almost 40 minutes outside Nashville, past shopping centers, past neighborhoods, past everything familiar. Eventually, it turned through enormous wrought iron gates. Beyond them stood an estate unlike anything I'd ever seen. Stone walls, perfect gardens, security cameras, private lake. Claire whispered, "Who lives there?" I had no idea. But Daniel walked through the front door like he'd been there 100 times. Neither of us spoke during the drive home. Questions piled upon questions. Who was the older man? Why had Daniel lied? Why hide the meeting? Most importantly, why did he look so different? More relaxed, more confident, almost powerful, as if the version of Daniel I knew existed only outside those gates. That evening, he arrived at my apartment carrying takeout from my favorite Italian restaurant. I missed you today. He kissed my forehead. I smiled mechanically. So, how was work? He sighed dramatically. Brutal. I've been in meetings since lunch. The lie arrived effortlessly, without hesitation, without guilt. For the first time, I noticed something astonishing. He wasn't merely lying. He believed his own performance. Dinner tasted like cardboard. He chatted happily about honeymoon plans. I nodded at the appropriate moments. Inside, my thoughts raced. Finally, I asked, "So, who owns Hawthorne House?" The fork froze halfway to his mouth, only for a fraction of a second. Then, "What?" "The hotel downtown. I passed it today." "Oh," he smiled. "I don't know. I've never been inside." There it was. Another lie. Smooth. Elegant. Perfectly delivered. Except, I'd watched him walk through its front doors. That night, after he left, I couldn't stop thinking about the older man. Where had I seen him? Then it hit me. The charity gala. Months earlier, the same man had stood across the ballroom, watching Daniel. Not speaking. Simply watching. At the time, I'd assumed he was another donor. Now, I wasn't so sure. Saturday morning, I arrived at Grandma's before sunrise. She was already awake, standing on the porch, as though she'd been expecting me. I followed him. She simply nodded. And he lied. Again. She nodded, then quietly asked, "Did you notice something else?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "The way he walks." I blinked. I wasn't paying attention. She smiled sadly. "That's because you're still looking for proof. I look for patterns." She handed me an old photograph. The edges had turned yellow with age. A wedding photograph. Not hers. I didn't recognize anyone. "Who's this?" "A woman named Helen." "What happened to her?" Grandma looked toward the mountains. She married a man everyone admired. They had a beautiful home, beautiful children, a beautiful life. Then she looked back at me. Until one day, she discovered she'd married a stranger. What happened? Grandma's voice became almost a whisper. "Nothing." I stared. "What do you mean, nothing?" She never left him. She convinced herself she'd imagined everything. She lived another 32 years. Were they happy? Grandma slowly shook her head. "No, they were convincing." The distinction hit me like ice water. Not happy. Convincing. Before I left, she caught my wrist. "Emily, if someone makes you question your own eyes, they're already taking something from you." Driving home, I kept replaying that sentence. Question your own eyes. Hadn't I been doing exactly that for weeks? Every lie. I explained away. Every strange feeling, I dismissed. Every warning, I debated. Not because the evidence was weak, because I wanted another ending. That afternoon, everything exploded. Claire called. She sounded breathless. Emily, I found out who the older man is. My heart stopped. Who? He isn't Daniel's business partner. He isn't family. Then who is he? There was a long silence. When Claire finally answered, her voice barely rose above a whisper. Emily, he's the director of the children's home where Daniel grew up. And, according to someone who still works there, Daniel hasn't used his real last name in over 15 years. My blood turned to ice. What? That's not the only thing. They said, Claire hesitated. What? They said every person from his childhood disappeared from his life. Friends, teachers, foster families. No one knows where he went. No one knows why he changed his identity. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers went numb. For the first time. This wasn't about a troubled relationship, or cold feet, or another woman. The man I was about to marry might not even be the man he claimed to be. And I had less than 48 hours before I was supposed to say, I do. The morning of my wedding, I asked him one question. His answer saved my life. People imagine that fear feels like panic. It doesn't. Real fear is strangely quiet. It sharpens everything. The ticking of a clock, the hum of a refrigerator, the sound of your own heartbeat. The morning of my wedding, I woke before sunrise. For several minutes, I simply lay there staring at the ceiling. My wedding dress hung beside the window, glowing softly in the pale morning light. 2 days earlier, I had dreamed about wearing it. Now it looked less like a dress, and more like a costume prepared for someone else's life. Claire had spent the night on my couch. She walked into the kitchen wearing oversized pajamas and carrying 2 mugs of coffee. Neither of us spoke for almost a minute. Finally, she asked, "What are you going to do?" I looked toward the window. "I don't know." "You do know." I closed my eyes. "No, you just don't want to admit it." By 7:30, my mother arrived. She hugged me tightly. She smiled. She laughed. She fussed over my hair. She tried very hard to pretend today was normal. Parents have a remarkable ability to hide their own fear from their children. But I noticed her hands. They trembled while fastening the tiny pearls on my veil. She noticed me watching. Quietly, she whispered, "You don't have to do this." I looked at her in surprise. "What? If something feels wrong, you don't owe anyone a wedding. Not the guests. Not the church. Not the money already spent. Not even the man waiting at the altar." Those words settled something inside me. For the first time all week, I felt calm. Instead of driving directly to the chapel, I made one stop. Grandma's farmhouse. She was already sitting on the porch, wrapped in her old blue shawl, a steaming mug resting between weathered hands. She smiled when my car pulled into the driveway. "I wondered whether you'd come." I needed to. She motioned toward the rocking chair beside her. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth across the hills. Finally, I asked, "Tell me the truth. Am I making the biggest mistake of my life?" Grandma looked at me for a long time, long enough that tears began forming in my eyes. Then she answered, "No." I blinked. "What? The biggest mistake is staying after the truth introduces itself." She reached into the pocket of her sweater and handed me a tiny brass key. It was old, worn smooth by decades of use. "What's this?" "The attic. I've never been in your attic." "I know. It's time." The attic was filled with trunks, books, boxes, photographs. The smell of cedar and old paper wrapped around me. Grandma pointed toward a weathered wooden chest. Inside were dozens of journals, every one carefully dated. "These are yours?" She nodded. I wrote down every warning I ever gave. I opened one at random. The pages were covered with careful handwriting. Dates, names, events, predictions, and beside nearly every entry, the outcome. Some were ordinary, others impossible. Then I found something unexpected, an entry from 30 years earlier. My father's name, my mother's, mine. I stopped breathing. Grandma had written about me, years before I was born. Not dramatic predictions, simple observations. She will ask too many questions. She will love deeply. She will mistake kindness for safety. A tear rolled down my cheek. "Why did you write these?" She smiled gently. "So I would remember." "Remember what?" That seeing someone's future isn't magic, it's responsibility. Then she became serious. Emily, I need you to understand something. I have never once seen the future. I stared. What? I don't predict. I observe. I simply notice what everyone else ignores. I frowned. But all those warnings. She nodded. When your father ignored chest pain for years, I didn't need supernatural powers. When your mother insisted on staying at that hotel despite electrical fires already being reported, I didn't need visions. When your fiancé? She stopped. When Daniel? She looked directly into my eyes. I saw a man who never reacted emotionally. He reacted strategically. There is a difference. Everything suddenly made sense. She wasn't psychic. She was extraordinarily observant. She noticed patterns invisible to everyone else. Small behaviors, tiny inconsistencies, micro-expressions, habits. She had spent 80 years studying people. Everyone else had mistaken wisdom for prophecy. I hugged her. Hard. I was so afraid. I know. What if I'm wrong? She gently touched my cheek. Then you'll lose a wedding. She smiled sadly. If you're right, you'll save a lifetime. An hour later, I walked into the chapel. More than 200 guests stood as the music began. Daniel waited at the altar. Perfect tuxedo, perfect smile, perfect posture. He looked exactly like the man everyone believed him to be, including me, until recently. Halfway down the aisle, I stopped walking. The music continued. Confused whispers spread through the room. Daniel smiled uncertainly. Emily? I looked at him. Really looked. Not at the tuxedo, not at the smile. At him. Then I asked one question. One simple question. Loving someone means wanting what's best for them. He nodded. Of course. So tell me, if I walked out that door right now, would you chase me? Or would you let me go because it would make me happy? Silence. It lasted only 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, his face changed. The warmth vanished. The concern disappeared. His jaw tightened. His eyes hardened. For the first time, he forgot to perform. And everyone saw it. Not just me. Everyone. Then he smiled again. Too late. The mask had already slipped. I think you're overwhelmed, he said softly. We can talk after the ceremony. No. His smile faded. No. I asked a question. You didn't answer. The chapel was completely silent. Even the musicians had stopped playing. Daniel looked around the room, searching, calculating, evaluating, exactly as Grandma had described, strategically. Finally, he spoke. If you leave now, you'll regret it. Not, I'll miss you. Not, I love you. Not, I'll fight for us. Just, you'll regret it. That was my answer. I removed the engagement ring, walked to the altar, placed it gently in his hand. I hope one day you learn the difference between loving someone and simply wanting to possess them. Then I turned around and walked back down the aisle. This time, my mother followed. Then my father. Then Claire. Half the guests left with us. The other half remained frozen in disbelief. Weeks later, the truth slowly emerged. Daniel had indeed changed his name years earlier. Not because he was a criminal. Not because he was hiding from the law. He had spent his childhood moving through foster homes, reinventing himself each time, learning exactly who people wanted him to be. He had become extraordinarily skilled at reading expectations and performing them. He wasn't evil. He was empty. He had built an identity from borrowed pieces until he no longer knew who he really was. He entered therapy voluntarily. I genuinely hope he found the help he needed. But I also learned something equally important. You can have compassion for someone's past without sacrificing your future. Months later, I sat on Grandma's porch watching the sunset. She poured tea into 2 old mugs, the same mugs we'd used for years. I smiled. You know, people still think you're psychic. She laughed. That's because magic is easier to believe than paying attention. We both laughed. The wind rustled through the pine trees. The world felt quiet again, peaceful. Not because my life had gone according to plan, but because I had finally understood something that changed me forever. Love isn't proven by beautiful words, or grand gestures, or perfect performances. Love is revealed in the moments when someone forgets they're being watched. And sometimes, the greatest act of courage isn't walking toward the altar, it's walking away from it.